In the third year since our daughter was abducted, Martin gave up searching. He said, "Life and death are beyond our control. I can't be selfish anymore. The most important thing is to live well in the present." But later, his first love also went missing. Martin, however, went gray overnight and spent 50 years searching for her. In this new life, I protected our daughter ahead of time and filed for divorce. Unexpectedly, Martin was also reborn. On his first night back, he booked plane tickets and took his first love on a trip abroad. It wasn't until 6 months later that he remembered our daughter. Martin came holding a doll he'd bought at the airport, intending to pick her up from school. But our daughter pushed him away without hesitation and ran into another man's arms, saying, "Sorry, I already have a new dad." When I received news of Mandy's disappearance, Martin and I had just had a huge argument. He grabbed my shoulders, almost shouting, "Eve's been missing for 3 years. We've tried everything, but we can't find her. Life has to go on, can't you just move forward?" I slapped him hard, feeling a deep chill in my heart. "But we're Eve's parents. If we don't search for her, she'll never come back." Eve was our daughter. When she was 5, her nanny took her to the park to enjoy the sun. The moment the nanny turned her head, our child was gone. Terrified, the nanny didn't report it immediately, missing the best chance to save Eve. Martin and I tried every way we could think of, but we never found a trace of Eve. She had vanished like she never existed. This year marks the 3rd year of her disappearance. But suddenly, Martin told me he didn't want to continue searching. He wanted me to give up too, to move on, live in the moment, and have another child. His cold indifference made him feel like a stranger to me, and it broke my heart. Eve was a part of me. Losing her was like having a piece of flesh cut out from my body. It was too painful to bear, and I could never give up. So we had the fiercest argument since we got married. Before, I always loved him more, and I'd often give in. Martin knew I loved him, and he used that to push me to compromise. But when it came to Eve, there was no way I would back down. Everything in the house was smashed, and my desperate yelling drained every bit of energy I had. But he watched coldly, as if I were a clown. "Wendy, you're too selfish. Why ruin our home for a child we can't bring back?" His initial guilt gradually turned into impatience. He left that statement behind and locked himself in the bedroom. The noisy living room suddenly fell silent. I sat on the couch, staring at a photo of our daughter on my phone, unable to stop crying. Then, out of nowhere, a message came through. Mandy was missing. That smart, beautiful girl had transferred to our class in high school and caught the attention of many boys, including Martin. I had barely processed the message, but the tightly closed bedroom door suddenly swung open. Martin, looking frantic, kept making phone calls, but no one answered. He kept mumbling, "Mandy, please be okay." Martin was always calm. Even when Eve went missing, he stayed composed. But now, he was panicking, trembling hands unable to dial properly. To Martin, Mandy was like his first love. Back then, it didn't bother me. Martin was the man I had loved since childhood. Our families were well matched, and we grew up together like childhood sweethearts. I loved him, had always loved him. But he was indifferent by nature, so his unusual attention to Mandy in high school had nearly broken my heart. However, Mandy chose to study abroad, letting go of him, and their budding relationship ended before it even began. Martin had been in a slump for a long time before he finally came out of it, and he never mentioned Mandy again. I stayed by his side, year after year. Finally, I waited long enough for him to confess to me. We became a couple, got married, and had our lovely Eve. I cherished this relationship deeply. But now, looking back, I felt like the biggest joke. I thought Martin's reaction to Mandy's disappearance was just a fleeting sentiment from his high school days. But I didn't expect that after confirming Mandy was truly missing, Martin's grief would cause him to turn gray overnight. Yet, when Eve went missing, he had stayed calm, without the slightest sign of distress. It turns out, a child born with a woman you don't love doesn't matter as much. In the end, Martin decided to help the Chung family search for the missing Mandy. I asked him, "What about our daughter? The daughter who had been missing for 3 years, taken by human traffickers, what about her?" Martin averted his gaze. "We've searched for Eve for 3 years, that's long enough. But Mandy's different, she just disappeared. If we try hard enough, maybe we can find her." That effort took a lifetime. I searched for Eve my entire life, and he searched for Mandy his entire life. We fought countless times over this. I urged him to let go. Mandy had her family, her parents to search for her. But Eve needed us more. Martin, however, lashed out at me. Wendy, you're so selfish. Mandy is a living, breathing person. How can we give up on her? Disappointment, heartbreak, and anger left me completely dead inside when it came to this man. As we aged, we still hadn't found either Eve or Mandy. We could only lie in our respective hospital beds. I stared at a photo of my daughter, and he stared at one of Mandy, full of sorrow, a tragic irony. If I could do it all over again, I wish Eve never had you as a father. Because he didn't deserve it. But unexpectedly, I really was reborn. Back to the day our daughter was nearly taken by traffickers. I dashed out of the house, running as fast as I could, desperate to save Eve before the trafficker showed up. Thankfully, I reached her just in time, scooping her into my arms and yelling at the negligent nanny to call the police immediately. A human trafficker in our community was a serious matter. Many neighbors, worried the trafficker had accomplices, gathered around, waiting for the police, wanting justice to be served. I stayed as well, but from a distance, I saw Martin rushing out of the house. At this time, he should have just returned from a business trip, exhausted and trying to sleep off his jet lag. It wasn't until the nanny couldn't find Eve that she'd have told me Eve was missing. That's when Martin would have woken up in shock. But now, things seemed different. Had Martin also been reborn? If so, he should have known the most important thing was to save our poor Eve, not run around in a panic. I didn't have time to think it over as the police arrived, and I had to take Eve to give a statement. By the time everything was done, it was already dark. Where's Daddy? Eve clung to my hand as we entered the house and ran straight to the bedroom. She adored Martin, always hugging his leg and calling him Daddy in her sweet little voice. But the bedroom was empty. Martin still hadn't come home. Eve was a little disappointed, but ever the obedient child, she forced a smile. She didn't see Daddy, so she assumed, as always, that he was just busy with work. I haven't finished my book yet. If Daddy finds out I didn't read, he'll be mad. She cheerfully ran to the living room, found a spot, and sat down with her storybook, reading intently. The regret from my previous life made me unwilling to leave Eve's side for even a moment now. I sat with her, holding her close. She turned, smiling at me, and kissed my cheek. Mommy, don't be sad. Daddy will come home after work. I'll wait with you. Maybe it was because of the memories from my past life. This man I once loved so deeply, but resented for half my life, now, even though everything seemed to be back on track, I refused to compromise for him or my daughter. Divorce was inevitable. But no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't reach Martin. His phone was off, like he had vanished from the face of the earth. A whole day and night passed without any contact. Did bad guys take Daddy? Eve, though young, was more mature than other kids her age and could always pick up on my emotions. She tugged at my dress, her eyes filled with sadness. I quickly bent down to hug her, gently soothing her. No, sweetie, Daddy probably just got held up with something important. But your birthday is the day after tomorrow, and Daddy will definitely be back for that. Really? Her big round eyes were filled with hope. But the reality was, he went to see Mandy. That evening, I was holding Eve while reading her a bedtime story. She fell asleep in my arms, so I picked up my phone nearby, opened my social media, and immediately saw Mandy's latest post. A picture. A line of text. A pair of hands wrapped tightly around her waist, looking incredibly intimate. The caption read, "After all this time, I finally waited for your confession." There was a scar on the index finger of that right hand. Ironically, Martin had one too. And in the comments section, everyone was congratulating Mandy and the faceless man, wishing them happiness. I glanced at the location tag. It was an island abroad, a famous spot for couples. When Martin and I first started dating, he told me he'd take me there, and we'd show off our love to everyone. But he was too busy with work, so we had to wait. And that wait stretched to our wedding, and then to the birth of our child. 1 year after another passed, and it never happened. Now, Martin has dropped everything just to make up for what he lost and taken his first love on this romantic getaway abroad. How carefree. I stared at that photo, but I couldn't muster any emotion. Maybe I was too disappointed in my past life. I'd felt pain, cried, and argued. After the hysterics, when our eyes met, all that remained was disappointment and resentment. I zoomed in on the photo, saved it. Since I'd already decided to divorce him, I would definitely fight for Eve's custody. And any evidence proving his infidelity? I needed to keep copies, so I could protect myself during the divorce. I consulted a lawyer and drafted the divorce agreement. But Martin was abroad, deliberately cutting off all communication. I couldn't get the papers to him right away. So I had to wait, and I told my parents. As expected, when I mentioned divorcing Martin, they strongly opposed it. I didn't hide anything and told them about Martin's affair. My mom stared at the photo in silence for a long time. Finally, she looked up at me with an unreadable expression in her eyes. "Wendy, some things, you just have to turn a blind eye to, and life will go on. Especially now that you have a daughter. For her sake, don't be selfish, okay?" My own mother was telling me to forgive my husband's betrayal, for the sake of our child. I always knew my parents were cold, putting work and family interests first. But I never expected that even now, my happiness was worth less than the benefits of this ridiculous marriage alliance. No, Mom. If I choose to tolerate this, that's the real selfishness and irresponsibility. My life is not Eve's life. I can take care of her just fine on my own. After all, with or without Martin, those years made no difference. I would feel guilty toward Eve because I couldn't give her a complete family. But I wasn't the one who caused all this. So why should I swallow the bitter fruit that Martin planted? My dad lost it and slapped me. He even said that if I got divorced, he'd never let me come home again. If I divorced, I'd be completely cut off. I'd be a Wendy with no home. I couldn't hold it in and let a few tears fall. It's fine. Let's just say, the bond between father and daughter ends here. In any case, divorce was inevitable. I took Eve and left. I didn't go home right away. Halfway through the drive, I couldn't hold back my emotions anymore, so I pulled over in a quiet spot and started crying in front of my daughter. Eve was so sweet. She unbuckled herself from her car seat, climbed into the front seat next to me, and silently patted my back. When I looked up, she pulled out a couple of tissues and wiped my tears. "Mommy, don't be sad. Eve's here. Eve will always be here." Her little voice still had that babyish lilt. I looked at her and asked, "If Mommy and Daddy separate, would you want to stay with me?" Eve didn't answer right away. She tilted her head, deep in thought. After a while, she asked, "If we leave Daddy, will Mommy be happy? Will you stop crying then?" I didn't know how to answer her. With a bit of a sob, I murmured, "Yes." Eve immediately smiled, stretched out her little arms, and hugged me, imitating how I used to hold her. "I want Mommy to be happy. I don't want Mommy to cry. Daddy's bad, I don't want him either." I couldn't hold it anymore, and I hugged Eve tight, crying with her. She started laughing but suddenly pouted, like she'd been wronged, and threw herself into my arms, crying too. We were crying so hard that my chest started to hurt. Eve knew I had a heart condition. She quickly wiped her tears and searched the car for my medication. But the pain in my chest was so intense that my vision started to blur, and I blacked out. Just before I lost consciousness, I vaguely saw Eve frantically picking up my phone, trying to call Martin. But no one answered. When I woke up, I found myself lying in a hospital bed. I was dazed for a few seconds, then hurriedly sat up and looked around. "Where's Eve?" I had passed out so suddenly. I was terrified something had happened to her. I couldn't bear the pain of losing her again. Maybe she heard my voice, because Eve, who had been sitting on the couch reading a book, put it down and ran to the bed. I hugged her tight. She sat next to me, her eyes still glistening with tears. "Mommy, you're finally awake." Her voice still carried a bit of a sob, but she was smiling, quietly leaning against me. I asked her, "Eve, who brought Mommy to the hospital?" Eve started counting on her fingers like she was trying to remember. "It was a really handsome uncle." Just as she finished speaking, the door to the hospital room opened. A voice called out, "You're awake?" I turned to look, and when I saw who it was, my eyes widened in shock, and I couldn't help but shout, "Robert?" Robert was also my high school classmate. But he and Martin were polar opposites. Martin was cold, like a flower on a high peak, distant and untouchable. But Robert was warm, always smiling, always enthusiastic about people and life, lighting up the world around him. Not only that, Robert and I were childhood friends. His grandfather had liked me a lot when I was little. Our families even joked about arranging a marriage between us. But then I met Martin and followed him with all my heart. Later, Martin and I got together, and Robert was accepted to a prestigious foreign university and left to study abroad. In my last life, Robert never came back. Or maybe he did, but at the time, I was so focused on my missing daughter that I didn't pay attention. So seeing him now felt like a dream. You have a heart condition. The doctors always warned you not to get too emotional. Luckily, I happened to be driving by this time. Robert peeled an apple, carefully sliced it into small pieces, and handed one to me on a toothpick, giving another to Eve. Eve thanked him, her innocent smile lighting up her face. Robert, how did you know Mommy always likes her apples cut into small pieces? Robert playfully tapped her nose and looked at me with that familiar warmth, mixed with a hint of teasing. Because she's been like that since she was little. If it's not cut up, she won't eat it. Eve shook her head, but at home, Daddy never cuts Mommy's fruit. Mommy always prepares it and serves it to Daddy instead. Robert's smile faltered. He looked at me quietly for a long time without saying a word. Why are you staring at me like that? His gaze made me feel a bit uneasy. I pretended to focus on eating the apple, and Robert suddenly smacked my forehead. It actually hurt a little. Ow. I'm still a patient. I couldn't help but shout. We were childhood friends, so familiar with each other. After the initial awkwardness, things quickly returned to how they used to be. With Robert, I always acted unreasonably, teasing him on purpose. And he always let me. Just like now, even after my outburst, he ignored it and handed me another piece of apple. Don't get worked up, just eat some more fruit. I grabbed the plate and popped 2 more pieces in my mouth, but I couldn't help mumbling. We haven't seen each other in years, and the first thing you do is hit me? No explanation? Robert shrugged with a grin, what can I say? I've always liked teasing you since we were kids. After speaking, he turned and walked out, saying he was going to find my attending physician. I was busy eating my fruit, so I didn't hear what he mumbled at the door. I hate seeing you compromise for others. If only I could snap you out of your love-struck state. There wasn't much wrong with me physically. After I woke up, the doctor came by for another checkup and then told me I could go home and rest. I'd already made up my mind to get a divorce. The house we lived in, the one we called our marital home, was under Martin's name, and I didn't plan on staying there. I intended to move out with Eve. I owned several properties myself, so I let Eve pick her favorite, and we planned to move there. When Robert found out about the divorce and that I was moving out, he immediately came to help. In less than a day, all of Eve's and my things were packed and moved to the new place. Our new home was just 1 street away from where Robert lived now. When Eve found out, she was overjoyed. Do you like Robert? That evening, I held Eve in my arms. She snuggled against me, rambling on about Robert. These past few days, it's been like Robert didn't have a job. He came over every day, eating meals with us. The moment Eve came home from school, the 2 of them would stick together, as if they'd known each other forever. They even planned to go out over the weekend, without bothering to invite me. It made me feel like a third wheel. Sensing my sadness, Eve quickly hugged my neck and planted a few kisses. Robert's great. He always plays with me and is really patient. Not like Dad, who's always saying he's busy. He didn't even come to my birthday yesterday. It was Robert who stayed with me and gave me the present I wanted the most. If Robert were my dad, that would be perfect. There was a hint of sadness in Eve's eyes as she spoke. Children's worlds are simple. Eve might not be very clever yet, but she's perceptive. She can tell how distant Martin is, and compared to that, Robert is giving her a kind of fatherly love she's never experienced. My heart ached for her, and I held her even tighter. Martin doesn't deserve to be a father. That afternoon, when Eve came home from school, she wasn't in a good mood. I asked her what was wrong, but she barely acknowledged me. It wasn't until dinner that she spoke, her voice small and sad. There's a school event, and a few activities need dads to participate. But, Daddy, I sighed and said, it's okay, Mommy can join. Eve shook her head, still looking downcast. She stared at her bowl of rice, deep in thought, when the doorbell rang. I didn't need to guess who it was the usual dinner guest. My previously upset daughter's face lit up immediately. Robert's here. She jumped off her chair and ran to open the door for him. Eve is even cuter today, Robert said as he carried her to the table, the two of them acting like father and daughter. I felt a little jealous, shooting Robert a bitter glance. I worked so hard to bring this little girl into the world, and she's closer to you than she is to me. It's like I had her for you. Robert's smile grew even brighter, and he followed my lead. Well, it wouldn't be so bad if you had her for me. I promise I'd raise her well. I quickly grabbed Eve from his arms. Dream on, she's my precious daughter. Eve, acting all grown up, squeezed my hand and said, stop fighting, both of you. One is daddy, one is mommy, and I love you both. Right, just a few days ago, Eve had become his goddaughter. She looked at Robert, blinking her big eyes, then said, Mommy, since he's already daddy, can Robert be my dad and go to the event with me? I looked at Robert, and he looked back, as if waiting for my decision. I hesitated for a moment but eventually shook my head. I don't think that would be appropriate. But all the other kids' dads are coming, and my dad, he hasn't even called in so long. Why can't Robert be my dad? Mommy, I don't want the other kids to make fun of me for being the child whose dad doesn't care. Her voice grew more and more pitiful, and tears welled up in her eyes, making my heart ache. Robert chimed in quickly, Eve's my goddaughter now, and Martin's off having fun overseas. Why don't you just let me go? Do you really want Eve to be teased by her classmates? Of course, I didn't want that. So, for Monday's parent-child event, Robert played the role of dad, and the two of us went to the school together. The games were simple. Some tested the bond between father and daughter, while others focused on how well parents knew each other. For example, what's mommy's favorite color? Robert, purple. What's mommy's favorite fruit? Robert, apples. What does mommy hate the most? Robert, being lied to. He answered every question quickly and correctly, and I couldn't help but give him a thumbs up. The host, one of the teachers, smiled at the crowd of kids and parents, then asked the last question. So, who is Daddy's favorite person? Many parents answered with their child's name. I wrote down Eve, because that's the only right answer for this kind of question. But Robert's answer was, you. Me? I was so surprised I pointed at myself without thinking. The host laughed, it looks like Eve's parents have a great relationship. He's the only dad here who didn't write their kid's name. For some reason, my heart started racing. Even after that round ended, my heart hadn't calmed down. Robert, holding Eve's hand, walked over to me. What's wrong? Is your heart acting up again? His voice was as gentle as always, full of genuine concern. I shook my head. Robert, why didn't you write down Eve's name? His smile faltered for a moment before he said, as Eve's dad, of course I love her. But I also love her mom, so. I don't think my answer is wrong. It was wrong. So wrong. My heart raced even faster. Over the next 2 months, I began to feel like Robert had completely moved into my home. Sure, we grew up together, and our families were close, but we're adults now. I'm married and have a child, it's not appropriate. Robert didn't care. He seriously refuted me, saying, aren't you getting a divorce? Don't tell me you're just playing hard to get and still hoping to get back with Martin. If you are, I'll lose all respect for you. Wendy, if someone isn't right for you, you need to let them go. That's not it. I just thought we should keep a little distance. I never said I was hesitating. But after he said that, Robert got inexplicably angry and took Eve to her room, completely ignoring me. It wasn't until dinner, when I reassured him multiple times that I wouldn't go back to Martin, that he finally let out a sigh of relief. Good. You're still salvageable. I forced a smile. Robert, do I not have any dignity? Eve sat between us, resting her chin in her little hands, grinning at us with happiness in her eyes. If time could stop at that moment, I might almost believe that this was the happiness I had always longed for. But, unfortunately, reality called. In the 3rd month, Martin and Mandy finally finished their vacation and returned to the country. As soon as Martin got back, he suddenly remembered his poor daughter and immediately showed up at the school gates, ready to pick Eve up. I ran into him at the school entrance. He was holding a doll, one of the kinds Eve didn't like. When he saw me, he looked a bit guilty and awkward. "Wendy, work stuff came up. I had to leave the country in a hurry and forgot to tell you." I just replied with a casual He had been on vacation with his mistress, but here he was pretending it was work. Not a word of truth came out of his mouth, which only made me despise him more. But it didn't matter. Once he signed the divorce papers, he could do whatever he wanted. Perhaps sensing my coldness, or maybe because he really did feel guilty, Martin started to try explaining things. I didn't want to hear it, so I cut him off. "It's almost time. Eve will be out soon." That finally shut him up, and he stood there, holding that ugly doll, waiting for Eve. Eve was all excited at first, but the moment she saw Martin, the smile on her face immediately faded, and her quick little steps slowed down to a crawl. "Eve, look at what Daddy brought you." Eve was his own flesh and blood, after all. Family and lovers are different from the start. He could treat me with cold indifference, but he couldn't fully hide his guilt in front of his daughter. Eve took one glance at the ugly doll and her expression turned to one of disgust. In the past, even if Martin often gave her toys she didn't like, for the sake of that pitiful fatherly love, Eve would still accept them against her will and say she liked them. But lately, she's been spending all her time with Robert. Robert's never been one to force himself to do things he doesn't like. Whether he likes something or not, it's always crystal clear. He never stoops to pleasing others at the cost of his own happiness. So, if he doesn't like something, he's not afraid to say it loud and clear. Now, Eve no longer pretends to be happy to save Martin's face. Instead, she simply acted like she didn't see it and walked straight to my side. "Mom, are you the only one picking me up from school today?" There was a hint of anticipation in her eyes. Robert had promised her yesterday that he'd come pick her up with me after school today. But in the afternoon, Robert got an urgent call from his family, sounding like something serious had happened. He rushed back home, saying he'd return as soon as possible, but he didn't specify when. As I was trying to figure out how to explain this to her, Martin came over again, still holding the doll. "Eve, why are you ignoring Daddy? Daddy bought this doll especially for you. Do you like it?" As he handed the doll over, a receipt accidentally fell out. I glanced down and saw it. It was from the airport. Clearly, Martin had only remembered he had a daughter after returning to the country. How laughable. Eve is still young and doesn't know what buying something at the airport signifies. But she's not a fool. She can tell the difference between sincerity and indifference. Looking at Martin standing in front of her, Eve pursed her lips, not saying a word. I could see she was upset. She wanted to refuse, but hesitated, concerned about hurting Martin's feelings. I was just about to speak up on her behalf when Eve suddenly saw something that made her eyes light up. She pushed away Martin, who was trying to hug her, and took 2 steps back. "I stopped liking dolls like this a long time ago. And lying is bad. I saw on Mom's phone that you were on a vacation, not working. Also, I have a new dad now. If you don't like me and Mom, it's fine. I don't really need you either." With that, Eve grabbed my hand and started running off to the side. As soon as we turned, I saw Robert standing by the car, waving at Eve. "Daddy." Eve ran over and threw herself into Robert's arms, wrapping her arms around his neck and planting a big kiss on his cheek. Before, even though she had sworn loyalty to him as her godfather, most of the time, Eve still called him uncle. But today, if it weren't for her age, I would have thought she was deliberately provoking Martin. Seeing Martin's face darken like a storm cloud, I have to admit, it felt pretty satisfying. And Robert, with his blunt nature, carried our daughter straight over to Martin, his gaze full of blatant provocation. "My daughter hates this ugly doll. Don't bother giving it to her again, it's embarrassing. Wendy, I think you owe me an explanation." Martin had come to my new home, standing in the living room with a picture of me, Eve, and Robert in his hands, his face full of indignation. That photo was taken last weekend when we went on a picnic. Eve had wanted to go camping for a long time, but Martin always dismissed it as too childish and used work as an excuse to decline. Yet this time, when he was abroad on vacation with Mandy, they even took photos of themselves camping together. That day, I stared at those pictures, lost in thought, not realizing my daughter had woken up. She saw them. She didn't say anything, but her eyes turned red, and her pillow was wet with tears. When Robert found out, he canceled his work immediately and took Eve on a camping trip. We all had a great time that day. Eve's face was lit up with joy, the kind that had been missing for so long. Snapping out of my thoughts, I looked at Martin standing before me, and I couldn't muster a single emotion. Martin, this is pointless. In my previous life, I had screamed myself hoarse. I looked at the crazed woman in the mirror and felt disgusted. So in this life, I don't want to argue. I don't want to fight with him. I don't want to leave a crazy impression. Let's just end things quietly and go our separate ways. Martin's eyes darkened, and he smashed the photo frame onto the floor. Wendy, it's only been 3 months, and you're already tangled up with another man with my daughter. Do you think I'm dead? The glass shattered instantly, and the noise scared our daughter, who was doing her homework in the next room, into tears. I rushed to her room, picked her up, and soothed her while covering her ears. Then I turned to Martin. What difference would it make if you were? I stared at him coldly, all thoughts of an amicable separation now gone. I decided to tear down the last facade. Martin, do you really think I don't know anything? You think I don't know where you've been these past 3 months? You missed our daughter's birthday, you skipped her kindergarten events, and when I was hospitalized, you were still absent. When we needed you most, you were out there with another woman on vacation abroad. Then you come back and try to lie to me and Eve? Who's the fool here, Martin? Where do you even get the nerve to question me? Hearing this, the confidence in Martin's eyes faltered. And no, that's not it. I really had things to take care of. Mandy and it's not what you think. She just... I was only helping her fulfill a dream. He had cut off all contact and left no traces behind. But Mandy's social media was constantly updated, showcasing their love in broad daylight. Even though they never took a picture together, she always deliberately captured clues. Martin's necklace that he never took off. The red mole on his neck. The long scar on his lower abdomen. There were too many signs. So many that Eve only needed to take one look to know that the man in the photos was her father. I felt like a fool. But when I took out the divorce papers from the room, my tears fell anyway. Still, what could I do? This house was like a living hell. There was no way I would go through that again. So I slapped the papers onto his face, my voice resolute. Martin, let's get a divorce. At first, Martin shook his head without hesitation. Wendy, are you joking? Our marriage isn't just about us. It's tied to our family's businesses, and there's Eve. For her sake, can you stop being so selfish? Those words sounded strangely familiar. I suddenly remembered in my past life when I refused to give up searching for our daughter, he had called me selfish. And when I didn't want him to find Mandy, he also accused me of being selfish. How ridiculous. Whether it's for myself or for our daughter, I don't believe that staying married to a man who constantly cheats will benefit anyone. At least, the one in the wrong is you, not me. It was Martin who proposed to me, all the while still holding someone else in his heart. It was Martin who, when his daughter went missing, only cared about his first love. And even in this life, after everything, Martin's first choice was still Mandy. I had already signed the divorce papers. He was the one at fault, and I didn't feel greedy for claiming what I deserved. After all, it was all for my daughter's future. Martin, if you have any dignity, stop dragging this out. A divorce is best for both of us. Martin held the papers, looking a bit hurt, though I preferred to believe I was imagining it. He said, Wendy, after all these years, can you really just walk away like this? I echoed his words back to him, Martin, after all these years, have you really been thinking about another woman the whole time? He was silent. In the end, Martin signed his name. The photos on IG were damning evidence, undeniable proof he couldn't argue against. His cheating, his betrayal, it was all set in stone. Dragging this out any longer would only hurt both of our reputations. Martin was a businessman, and he understood that too. After the divorce, I suddenly felt a sense of relief. When I left the civil affairs office, I made a point of dressing up, planning to celebrate. But just as I was about to leave, Martin grabbed my wrist. Wendy, no matter what, we were married for 7 years. And Eve, she's always been my beloved daughter. If anything happens in the future, you can always come to me, you. No need. She has me, and that's enough. Before Martin could finish his sentence, Robert appeared out of nowhere, with Eve by his side. He immediately reached out and pulled me over. I lost my balance and fell right into Robert's arms. Eve covered her eyes with her tiny hands, but peeked through her fingers. A big smile spread across her face, clearly delighted. As for Martin, his eyes showed a mix of emotions I couldn't quite understand, along with resentment. Robert, this is my family matter. You. What family matter? Robert cut him off without hesitation, ready to confront him. Is abandoning your wife and daughter in the country while you go on trips abroad with another woman a family matter? Or disappearing when your wife and daughter need you most? If that's your idea of a family matter, then I'm sorry, but as an outsider, I can't respect that. With that, Robert threw a punch, landing it square on Martin's face. Robert, have you lost your mind? Why are you hitting him? I scolded him while dabbing medicine on his wounds. That punch left Martin stunned for a second, but then he swung back, and the two of them started fighting. Both had been learning boxing since they were kids, so every punch landed hard, and they weren't holding back. I was holding my daughter, unable to step in, so I could only watch as they exchanged blows. Punch after punch, until both of them were covered in blood, their clothes stained red. A civil affairs officer noticed the fight and quickly sent someone to break it up, but even they got accidentally hit. In the end, both men were taken to the police station. I had no choice but to bail Robert out. As for Martin, since we were already divorced, everything related to him was no longer my concern. Bailing him out? Not my responsibility. I just couldn't stand seeing him bully you, Robert said. His face was injured, one eye bruised and swollen, and his lips were also bruised. His cheek was scraped, and overall, he looked pretty beaten up. But Martin had it worse, he was covered in blood. Even if you couldn't stand it, there was no need to get physical. You still care about him? Robert's eyes dimmed for a moment. I suddenly pressed the cotton swab on his wound harder, making him yelp in pain before I spoke. I just think it's not worth dirtying your hands over someone like him. Robert's smile returned, and he gently shook his head. No, for you, it's worth it. The cotton swab slipped from my hand. My heart began racing for some reason, and his words felt. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination. So, I didn't respond. I just lowered my head and continued to clean his wounds. The air between us grew silent, a bit awkward. In the end, it was Robert who couldn't hold back. He grabbed my hand, forcing me to meet his serious gaze. He asked, Wendy, you understand what I'm saying, don't you? Do I understand? Maybe a little, but... Robert, I've been married and divorced. I spent almost 10 years proving I was blind and loved the wrong person. I have a daughter now. She's the most important person in my life, and I won't ever be separated from her, nor will I let her suffer. So, do you understand what I mean? Life isn't fair. A divorced woman, with a child, standing next to a successful, handsome man, people will always say we don't match. And I will never let my daughter suffer. I thought my words would make Robert back off, but instead, he only grew more serious. So what if you've been married? It was Martin who was blind and cheated on you. You never wronged him. And Eve, she's adorable. She calls me dad, and she's your daughter. She'll be my beloved daughter, too. No one will hurt her in front of me, I promise. So, do you understand what I'm saying? Whether I understood or not, I wasn't sure. All I knew was that I ended up fleeing the scene, leaving the matter unresolved. Robert's words were so sudden that I wasn't mentally prepared to respond. He knew that too, so for the next week, he didn't bring it up again, giving me time to think. As for Martin, after our divorce, he officially announced his relationship with Mandy. They flaunted their love openly on social media. Mandy, who used to subtly post photos, now directly sent me pictures and even warnings. Martin is my boyfriend now. Even though you have a daughter, please know your boundaries and don't act like the other woman. How ridiculous. I simply replied, so you do know being someone's mistress is shameless, huh? She was so angry that she blocked me. That suited me just fine. In the following months, I didn't pay attention to Martin's situation and just focused on living my own life. Occasionally, friends would bring them up when we met. At first, they were indignant on my behalf, saying Martin and Mandy were flaunting their relationship to provoke me. Later, they said the two had started arguing constantly over trivial matters. But I didn't care anymore. My mind was in turmoil, still unsure how to respond to everything. Robert had to go abroad for a few months to handle an issue at the company's overseas branch. I also suspected he was avoiding me. Because of that, Eve lost interest in her piano lessons for a while. After school, she would call Robert and tell him all about the fun things at kindergarten, and he would always listen attentively, never brushing her off. 3 months passed like that. Robert came back with a suitcase full of toys, all of Eve's favorites. As soon as he saw me, he skipped the pleasantries and got straight to the point. "Wendy, I've given you 3 months to think about it. Can you give me an answer now?" I lowered my head, hesitant to respond. Because I really didn't know how to respond to Robert's feelings. After all, I had just come out of a failed marriage. I wasn't sure if what awaited me was a clear sky after the rain or another deep abyss. I was scared. I was really scared. But I didn't hesitate for long. I took Eve shopping for clothes, and she pulled out her own pocket money, insisting on buying Robert a gift. She clung to Robert, refusing to let go. In the end, the three of us went shopping together. And then, by coincidence, I saw Martin at the mall, with Mandy by his side. They were in a children's clothing store. Martin was holding a pretty little dress, which, judging by its size, was likely for Eve. Mandy didn't look happy. She snatched the dress from Martin's hand and threw it to the ground. Even though they were a few stores away, I could still hear their argument clearly. "Martin, get this straight. You're divorced from Wendy. The child is with her, you don't need to buy something for Eve every time we go out." Mandy was furious, her once pretty face twisted with anger. The once lovey-dovey couple was now having a fierce argument. Martin wasn't as patient and accommodating as I imagined. The tenderness I once saw in his eyes was fading, replaced with irritation as he retorted, "So what if I'm divorced? Eve is still my daughter. If it weren't for being with you, I wouldn't have let Eve grow up without a father. I'm just trying to make it up to her by buying her a few clothes. Don't be so selfish." "Selfish?" Mandy pointed at herself, then suddenly burst into laughter. "Martin, who's the selfish one here? I was ready to give up on you, but you ran all the way abroad to confess to me, telling me I was the love of your life. That's why I stayed with you, even if it meant being called a homewrecker. And now that you're finally divorced, you're still thinking about Wendy and Eve, sneaking off every night to look at their pictures. What do you take me for?" She was speaking so loudly that others in the mall began to stare, their eyes full of curiosity. Martin had always cared about his public image. Seeing the attention they were drawing, he tried to pull Mandy out of the store, but she yanked her hand away, demanding he make a choice. "Martin, I want you to tell me right now. Do you want to be with me and build a life together, or are you going to crawl back to your ex-wife and give your precious daughter a complete family? Tell you what? How many times do I have to say it? Wendy and I are divorced, but Eve is still my flesh and blood. I can't just abandon her. Why do you have to make this so hard? You used to be so understanding. Why are you being so selfish now, forcing that poor little girl to lose even the last shred of family she has?" The farce ended with Mandy slapping him hard in front of everyone. Martin's face turned ashen as he spun around to leave, but just as he did, our eyes locked for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, maybe he was too embarrassed to say anything. We only exchanged a glance before he turned away again, without the slightest hesitation. Robert took Eve and me to the children's clothing store and picked out a dozen dresses, all of which she loved. "These, I'll buy them for you from now on." "We don't need his gifts," Robert said, gently pinching Eve's cheek, ensuring there was no hint of resistance in her expression. Then, with a wave of his hand, he bought even more dresses. When we got home, the first thing I saw was Martin, sitting in the hallway, clearly drunk. The slap mark was still visible on his face. Eve had already fallen asleep in my arms. I didn't let Robert drive me back since he had work the next morning and needed to rest. I opened the door and gently laid Eve down in her little bed. Martin stood at the doorway, reeking of alcohol, his eyes fixed on me with a strange look of grievance. "Do you need something?" I asked coldly, making the sorrow in his eyes deepen. Before, whenever I drank too much at a business dinner, you'd always personally make ginger tea for me. You never spoke to me in such a cold tone. His voice held a mix of sadness and frustration. But the truth is, you've only ever trampled on the kindness I showed you, haven't you? Maybe my voice was too cold, so cold that it sobered up his lust-clouded mind, at least a little. I tried to shut the door, but he held it open, a trace of confusion in his eyes. Wendy, if I hadn't agreed to the divorce, would we still be as happy as we used to be, like a family? There are no what-ifs in life. If you're still you, there will never be another outcome. It's like how a dog can never stop eating filth. Martin could never quell his restless heart. What he couldn't have would always make him restless. So, in his past life, he could chase after Mandy for 50 years, and in this life, after my resolute divorce, he could also admit his regret. But no matter the scenario, all it did was disgust me. He has a greedy heart, wanting everything but ending up with nothing. That night, Eve inexplicably developed a high fever, her whole body burning hot. She even started having convulsions. I rushed to carry her to the car, ready to drive to the hospital, when I saw Robert sitting by the flower bed at the entrance of the neighborhood. I didn't know what he was thinking about. He noticed me immediately, along with the unconscious Eve in my arms. I was so nervous that my hands were trembling, making it impossible to drive properly. It's okay, Wendy. It's normal for kids to get fevers. I'll take her to the hospital now. Don't worry, don't cry, Eve will be fine. Robert reassured me as he quickly drove us to the hospital. Fortunately, Eve was okay. It was just a viral infection that needed careful attention. Only after hearing the doctor's words did I finally let out a long sigh of relief. That entire night, Robert was running around, taking care of everything. He put Eve to sleep and told me to rest on the bed next to her. He stayed with the child all night, though we had agreed to take shifts. By the time I woke up, it was already bright outside. Robert had dark circles under his eyes, stifling a yawn with his hand. Seeing I was awake, he whispered, "Why didn't you sleep a little longer?" "I'll go get breakfast." "What would you like to eat?" Robert's voice was so gentle. So gentle that, on impulse, I blurted out, "Robert, let's give it a try. If this is still a deep pit, then maybe I'm just destined never to have happiness." After we confirmed our relationship, Robert was like a proud peacock showing off its feathers, immediately wanting to announce it on Instagram. He even moved in right away. Luckily, the house he picked was big enough, with plenty of empty rooms. He could pick whichever one he wanted. On Robert's first day after moving in, Eve was so excited. She immediately pulled out her phone and said we needed to take a family photo. 5 minutes after the photo was posted, an unfamiliar number called. I was in the shower at the time, and my phone was in the living room, so Robert answered it. I could faintly hear him speaking. "Looking for Wendy?" "She's in the shower. She's exhausted. Call her tomorrow." Exhausted, indeed. Eve had so much energy, dragging me around all day. I felt like my bones were falling apart. After I got out of the shower, Robert handed me the phone, his face a little sour. "It was him," he said. "Oh, Martin." There was no need to call back. I tossed the phone onto the couch and went to my room to dry my hair. Half an hour later, the food I ordered arrived. But as I stepped outside to get it, someone grabbed my wrist. "Wendy, are you with Robert now?" Martin's first words were accusatory. I yanked my hand away forcefully. "Who I'm with is none of your business." He frowned, confusion all over his face. "We've only been divorced for less than 6 months. How could you already be with someone else? You used to love me so much, said you'd marry no one but me. We even had Eve together. Now you can just fall in love like this? Did you ever really love me?" "Martin." I couldn't help but raise my voice. "I always knew you were selfish. But I never imagined your ability to twist the truth was this strong. You were the one who cheated, and now you're trying to play the victim?" "Yes, I'm with Robert, and we're doing it openly and honestly." But Martin wouldn't let it go. "We were together for 10 years and had a child. How could he not care? How could he truly love Eve?" I couldn't help it. I slapped him. "Just because you're dirty doesn't mean the whole world is like you. Robert isn't like you. He genuinely loves me, which means he's willing to love what I love too. Robert had once told me, Wendy, Eve is your daughter. I love you, so I'll love what you love. Martin was silent, leaning against the wall with slumped shoulders. After a long while, he spoke softly, so quietly I almost couldn't hear him. If I regret it now, would you give me another chance? I responded, don't humiliate yourself. A month later, I heard the news of Martin and Mandy's engagement. After all, it had been more than 6 months since our divorce. The night before they got their marriage certificate, Martin sent me a long message. I didn't read it carefully, but the gist was that he missed the life we had together and our well-behaved daughter. If I was willing, he would remarry me and help take care of Eve. I didn't respond. There was no point. But less than a month after they got married, they divorced. Mandy had always been sensitive, prone to magnifying even the smallest issues. And now, with Martin's overwhelming guilt, constantly trying to find opportunities to see Eve, their arguments were unavoidable. The more in love they had been, the fiercer their fights were now. But none of this has anything to do with me. I'm about to marry Robert. But on the day of the wedding, Mandy stormed in wearing a white dress. She rushed straight to the makeup mirror, reaching out as if to hit me. Robert immediately stood in front of me, protecting me from her attack. Wendy, how can you be so shameless? You're already divorced from Martin, yet you still cling to him all the time, making him constantly think about that little slut. If it weren't for you two, Martin and I wouldn't have ended up getting divorced. She had really mastered the art of blaming others, just like Martin. You were still his mistress while we were married. After I divorced him, we barely had any contact. The fact that you two constantly fight just shows how unstable your relationship is. Mandy, what makes you think you're any better? You came here to stir up trouble simply because you can't stand to see me happy. You're miserable, you're ugly, so you want the whole world to be just as unfortunate as you are. But why should they? You broke moral boundaries, and now you're paying the price. The more you act out, the more everyone will see, you deserve this. I snapped back harshly. She was so furious that she tried to hit me again, but Robert stayed in front of me the whole time, blocking her every attempt. She couldn't touch me at all. Martin arrived shortly after, rushing in after hearing the commotion. He grabbed Mandy, irritation evident in his eyes. What are you making a scene for? If you hadn't been so paranoid all the time, maybe we'd still be together. And now you're here confronting Wendy? What right do you have? Don't forget, you chose to be the mistress. His words cut deep. Martin had always been this cold and heartless. I was fortunate enough to walk away from him in time. Otherwise, that would have been my sad fate. After he finished speaking, Martin turned to look at me. By this time, I had already changed into my wedding dress, a beautiful bride. His eyes flickered with something unspoken, and his lips tightened with a trace of sorrow. Wendy, have you really made up your mind? I didn't answer, but the smile of happiness on my face said everything. He added, if I were to whisk you away right now, would you come with me? Robert's face turned grim, his fists clenched tightly. If I hadn't held him back, he would have punched Martin right then and there. I stepped closer to Martin and whispered so only the two of us could hear, in my past life, you made me feel nothing but disgust. Now that we've both been given a second chance, let's keep our lives separate. Martin, are you really going to throw away the last shred of your dignity? He froze, shocked. I didn't wait for his response, it was almost time for the ceremony. So, I didn't know that after hearing my words, Martin walked out of the hotel in a daze, as if his soul had left him. But Mandy didn't leave. Filled with pent-up frustration, she started hitting him over and over again. The two of them tangled together, fighting. By the roadside, neither of them noticed their footing until they both tumbled down the steps. A speeding SUV passed by. But I didn't know any of this yet. Right now, I was feeling a bit nervous. The doors opened, and I saw Robert standing at the end of the hallway, smiling at me. Our daughter, dressed as a little flower girl, held my hand and led me step by step toward Robert. Toward true happiness. Eve's epilogue. What if I told you I've been reincarnated, just like in those TV dramas? Does that sound unbelievable? That high fever made me remember so many things. I was only 5 years old, but I had memories of being 16. Why 16? Because that's how long I lived in my previous life. When I think back now, it was that damn human trafficker who sold me to a couple who couldn't have children. Not even a year later, they had their own child and abandoned me, as if I was never part of their family. I don't remember all the details clearly. But in the end, I was sold again. And again. I was beaten on purpose, my arms and legs broken, so I'd have to beg on the streets. Or I was forced to do things I didn't want to do. It was all so painful. I remembered where my home was. I remembered my parents' names. I remembered the warmth and happiness of the past. I remembered it all. But there was nothing I could do. Someone was always watching me, day and night, and I couldn't find any chance to escape. But there was a moment when fate gave me one last opportunity. Right before I was sold again, I saw my father on the street. His face was tired and worn. I thought it was because of my disappearance that he had grown so gaunt. I shouted with all my might, but he didn't recognize me. Not only did he not recognize me, he kicked me, saying I had dirted his pants. He said, "Mandy gave me these. You filthy beggar, don't touch me." Who was Mandy? I didn't know. I just saw the missing person flyer in his hand. The picture and name weren't mine. He wasn't looking for me anymore. I had no tongue, so I couldn't speak. I could only make garbled sounds, and all I got in return was his disgust. And the trafficker's anger. This time, my luck ran out. I was sold to a remote mountain village, where I became the bride of an old man. I was 16. Such a young age. But I died giving birth, bleeding out in childbirth. It hurt so much. So when I realized I had been reborn, I was both ecstatic and heartbroken. I knew my mother never gave up looking for me. But I also knew my father had given his heart to another woman. Still, Robert's appearance made me feel like happiness wasn't so far away after all. My father wasn't a good father, but Robert could give my mother the happiness she deserved. And he could be the father I needed. Suddenly, I felt lucky. At least in this life, I would have a complete and happy family. Me, Mom, and Dad, Robert. We would all be happy. The end.